Good evening, sisters. I hope this finds you well and able to enjoy some table fellowship, either with other sisters from the church or with some neighbors or friends. But it's really great to be able to gather around the table with you this evening. We actually are going to be talking about the power of gathering around the table as a way of building community and being fully present to one another. And to kind of lay a biblical foundation for that conversation, I want to take us to a very familiar story, especially for us as women, and that is the story of Jesus visiting Martha and Mary. And of course, this scripture comes from Luke chapter 10, and I'm going to be reading from verse 38. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a village where a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was worrying over the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you are so upset over all the details. There's really only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and I won't take it away from her." If you're like me, when we hear this story of Martha and Mary, you might be a little uncomfortable because, again, if you're like me, you might lean a little more towards the Martha tendencies than the Mary. And I actually think that there is a lot of merit at looking at this scripture and hearing where maybe God is not saying that we are to be Mary instead of Martha, but maybe what God is telling us and calling us to do is to really be able to embrace the both of Martha and Mary. One of the things I love that we hear in the very first verse, in verse 38, is that as Jesus and disciples were entering into the village, that Martha was readily preparing her home and welcoming them in. So we hear from the very first verse that Martha is doing that which really was the best of the culture. And that was she was extending that radical hospitality. She was anxiously welcoming people into her home. So I really think there is much wonderful that we hear about Martha. And there's much that we need to embrace in being Martha, where we too are called to extend hospitality to our neighbors, to those who come and pass our way. We're actually going to talk about that even more in our sermon this week, looking at Exodus 18 and how Abraham and Sarah actually extended hospitality to strangers as well. But why did Jesus then say to Martha that Mary had really been able to grasp the best thing and that he didn't want to take it from her? Well, again, we hear in the story that Martha was working really hard to not only prepare the home, but also to prepare the table, to prepare the meal that would be on the table. And I get that. I so relate to Martha. I love nothing more than being able to prepare a wonderful meal and to invite people to come and to sit at my table. But as Kelly and my family would readily attest, as much as I enjoy doing it, I do at times fret over the details, wanting to make sure that everything is just so when people arrive. And I'm wondering if maybe that's what Jesus was really trying to tell Martha. That Jesus wasn't telling Martha that what she was doing was not important, because we know it was important. Extending that radical hospitality was precisely what Martha was supposed to do. But what Jesus said to Martha was, "Martha, my dear Martha." Did you hear the endearment in which he spoke to her? He said, you're fretting, you're worrying over all the details. Maybe what Jesus was telling Martha, and maybe what Jesus is telling me, maybe what Jesus is telling you, is that when we come to this table, maybe it's not so important that everything is perfect when we come to the table, that the silver is shined and the crystal is without spots, but more that when we come to the table, we are ready and able to be fully present to the other people who come and sit at the table, and that we're not so tired and fretful when we get there that we can't enjoy the company and the community and the stories that will be shared. I actually want to share another reading with you this evening, and that is from a book called Kitchen Table Wisdom. The book is by Rachel Naomi Remen, and it's a beautiful book that I came across several years ago. And I'd like to read for you this beautiful introduction. The book is actually called The Kitchen Table Wisdom, Stories That Heal. And she talks about the power of community being able to extend a healing presence to one another. So listen to what Rachel has to say about the power of the table. Everybody is a story. When I was a child, people sat around kitchen tables and told their stories. We don't do that so much anymore. Sitting around the table telling stories is not just a way of passing time. It is the way the wisdom gets passed along. The stuff that helps us to live a life worth remembering. Despite the awesome powers of technology, many of us still do not live very well. We may need to listen to each other's stories once again. Most of the stories we are told now are written by novelists and screenwriters, acted out by actors and actresses, stories that have beginnings and endings, stories that are not real. But the stories that we can tell each other have no beginning or ending. They are a front row seat to the real experience. Even though they may have happened in a different time or place, they have a familiar feel, and in some way, they're about us too. Real stories take time. We stopped telling stories when we started to lose that sort of time, pausing time, reflecting time, wondering time. Life rushes us along, and few people are strong enough to stop on their own. Most often, something unforeseen stops us, and it is only then that we have the time to take a seat at life's kitchen table. So, the other thing I want to share with you this evening is actually my mama's kitchen table. This table where I am sitting now is the table where I grew up sitting every morning and every evening. And I have to say, this is probably my most precious and prized possession from my family home. The table is actually made from a church pew from my mama's home church in Swepsonville, North Carolina, Bethel United Methodist Church. And back in the 1950s, early 60s, the church burned, but they were able to save some of the pews. And they decided to sell the pews that they could save to raise money for the rebuilding of the sanctuary. So my daddy bought one of the pews, and if you can see the bench on the other side of the table, that's actually half of the pew. And my dad made the kitchen table out of the other half of the pew. I grew up eating every breakfast and every supper and many Sunday lunches sitting on that bench. That was my spot. And it was there that I sat and I listened to the stories told by my parents and my older brothers, by my aunts and uncles, by friends and neighbors who would come and sit around this table. This truly was the centerpiece of my family. And it truly was where the stories were told that shaped both who I am and whose I am. Some of you may remember one of the first sermons that I preached at West Market Church. I talked about how sociologists and the studies that have shown that the unraveling of American society can be tied back to the disappearance of the kitchen or dining room table. And of course, we know that that unraveling did not happen because the tables weren't perfectly set or there wasn't ever burnt toast at the table. It wasn't the details that made it the place that held us together as a family. What held us and shaped us as a family and as neighbors and as a community were the stories that were told here. Because, of course, sisters, it's the stories that bring healing and comfort. Sometimes it's the stories that maybe push us to go somewhere that we didn't think we were yet ready to go. They were the stories that transformed us and opened our hearts and minds, because it was at this table that maybe we learned something about someone we didn't know before. Maybe helped open our eyes to seeing people in a new way and even seeing ourselves in a new way. So friends, one of the things I think God is calling us to do is to reclaim this sacred space and time at the table. To create the time not to have a perfect meal prepared, but instead to be both Martha and Mary. To extend the hospitality, to welcome others to our table, but to be Mary and to be fully present to the people who gather at this table with us, to listen to their stories so that we can be instruments of healing as their stories of brokenness are shared. But we can also share in the rejoicing and the great news that is told around the table, and where we too can receive the healing and the comfort of others as they listen to our stories that are shared here as well. Enjoy your evening together, and let's really explore what it means to tell our stories.